Welcome to another Ammach Project Archives episode, and we're continuing today in the conference series, and we pick up now with 2013. The 2013 conference is what the Channel 4 and the Off the Fence production people used in part of their mockumentary. So it doesn't detract from the quality of speakers we had, however, and we're going to start with the absolutely amazing and resilient Anne Andrews. Anne has two sons with her husband Paul, and they live way out in the country. And I went to see them many long eons ago. And it's interesting to note that as I was speaking to Anne about, Paul began dropping off, nodding in the chair, and she said, honestly, every time we speak about this subject and he's in the room, it's like they cut him off. As she's an author, she's penned a couple of books. Initially, she had a hard time believing her son Jason was having experiences, and it took them quite a number of years, which she speaks about as being a regret. And so she's an amazing person to have such an understanding and really have a handle on what it's like not only to be a parent, but also to find out then that you yourself are an experiencer, as she did, as things began to unfold with her and Jason and her son Daniel, who also used to have a friend who then said, oh, it's actually Jason we need to be working with, and he has an original soul. What an amazing concept. What an amazing thing to say to a youngster, to a 4 or 5-year-old, as they were leaving him to go and then work with the new babe who was Jason, all of 30 or more years ago. So amazing things have happened to Anne and her family, and they've been warned off, they've had threats, all kinds of things. And for that, Jason no longer speaks publicly. He last spoke publicly at a probe conference in the UK in 2006, I believe, although they've spoken all over the place in Italy and America as well. But he had a horrific car accident and walked away unscathed, and decided that the threats were a little bit too hard to bear and didn't want to put his family at risk. So he carries on doing his work on those other layers of life that are unbeknownst to most of us, generally speaking. So you will find this talk absolutely riveting, I am sure. I just have to thank people like Anne for being willing to come forward. And in all of that rejection and not being able to accept what was going on until finally she had to, and you'll hear about that. It takes some really strong, ethical, highly evolved souls to come back, I think, and say, hey, I got that wrong. I got that wrong. Anne's been doing the speaking about her family's experiences, which are many. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and of course, share. All righty. Hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anne Andrews and the story. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me here. I feel very honoured to be here. I'd like to say I'm not a researcher. I'm a wife and a mother. I've been married to Paul for 35 years now. We have two sons, Daniel, who's almost 34, and Jason, who's almost 30. As I said, I'm just a normal wife and a mother who's had to try to come to terms with alien and paranormal experiences. These things have dogged me and my family for many, many years. And as you can see from the slide, we are a normal, everyday family. And our situation is one which is very much ongoing still. I'm going to give you snippets of our story so far. Obviously, I can't sort of fit everything in, but I hope it's enough to, if it helps somebody out there, then that's brilliant. I'll start by showing you a little bit about where we live. You'll see the relevance of this in a bit later. But as it says, our home is hidden in the trees, surrounded by hundreds of acres of fields. Again, our home in the deep countryside. And as you can see, that's the view from the front of our house, which is nothing but more fields. As I say, we live literally in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of acres of fields. There's our two boys, obviously Daniel when he was 6 and Jason when he was 2. Now, our oldest son Daniel was 4 years old, obviously, when Jason was born. But until then, Daniel had an invisible friend. Now, we didn't think this was odd at the time because obviously a lot of single children do have invisible friends. Now, but Daniel's friend was different. He said his name was Junus and that he came from the stars. Daniel had a fantastic, idea about stars. He used to say to me, "Look at that one, Mum, that's called this, that's called that." And we did sort of wonder about this, where did he get all this information from? But we put it down to the fact that he was just about starting school then, and maybe it was something on television. It was always strange, with Daniel's friend. Now, when Jason was born, the momentum seemed to shift from Daniel to Jason, because when Jason was a few weeks old, we would hear him crying in the night. We would go into his room, and we would find that he'd been moved. He was always in the room. Sometimes he was at the other end of the cot, sometimes underneath the cot, sometimes underneath a chair. Obviously, we were concerned. We spoke to, obviously, the health visitor about this. And she suggested it might be, that Daniel was maybe a little bit jealous of his baby brother. But when we asked Daniel about it, he was very adamant that he never touched a baby because Mummy told him not to. This sort of thing still happened, even when Daniel wasn't in the house. But again, sort of with our social upbringing and being very rational people, we just put it down to, well, perhaps it was our mistake, and just never really really embraced it. Now, after a few months, this whole thing stopped. Obviously, at that point, we thought, well, it must have been Daniel. We figured that maybe by standing on a chair, maybe by standing on tiptoes, he could reach the baby. But as it had all stopped, we never questioned it again. When Daniel was about 5 or 6, he came to us crying one day, and he said, "My friend Junus won't be able to see me anymore because he said that they've made a mistake and it's Jason they should be working with, not me." He was very tearful, and of course, again, believing it's an invisible friend, I just comforted him and said, "Oh, never mind, darling, you'll have other friends at school." And he looked at me and he said, "Mum," "Junus said Jason's got an original soul." He said, "What's that?" Again, I did the mum thing and I just fobbed him off. And I said, "Well, don't worry, we'll ask Daddy when he comes home because Mummy doesn't know." Nothing more was said about this, but as time went on, Jason became very frightened all the time. When he was just a few years old, he would tell us about little people that would come into his room and they would make him float away with them. And he said that they would take him to a hospital place, which he didn't like. And it was always cold there. Again, with being rational people, we just put it down to the fact that, okay, he's having nightmares for some reason. We didn't know why, but this is, again, what we put it down to. At his 4th birthday party, things really did step up. Because, so my mum was with us, and after the party and all the children had gone, there was a knock at the door. And it was very loud and insistent, and Paul answered the door, and there was nobody there. And there was a thunderstorm, which had just started. The knocking suddenly became louder. So again, Paul opened the door, and there's nobody there at all. Daniel came downstairs, because obviously he'd heard the thunder, and he was a bit frightened. Jason had fallen asleep on the sofa in the living room, and my mum sort of draped her coat across him. Suddenly there was a huge bolt of lightning, which actually filled the house. And Jason just sat bolt upright, and he just started spewing out incredible numbers. He was going into binary systems. I mean, this is a 4-year-old that can just about count to 5 on his fingers. Where on earth was he getting all this stuff from? He just wouldn't stop. And then the more he was talking, the more the knocking grew louder. It became more insistent. It was coming from everywhere. It's coming from the doors, the walls, the windows, the back of the house, the upstairs. My mum absolutely panicked. She just started crying and didn't know what to do. Then suddenly it started to recede. And Jason got up, and it was like he was walking, but he wasn't there. And he started going towards the door, and Paul sort of restrained him. And he said, "Where are you going, boys? It's pouring down. You're going to get soaked." And without even looking at his dad, he just said in a very sort of monotone voice, "I have to go. They're waiting for me." At that point, when Jason said those words, the knocking began again. Out of desperation, Paul reached for the phone. He said, "Right, I'm going to get the police. This is ridiculous." And he grabbed the phone. The phone wasn't working. There was no dial tone. There was nothing. Out of desperation, he threw the phone. And again, Jason was trying to get to the front door. Paul picked him up, and he sort of gently, he held him close to him because obviously, this was a guy, he didn't know what to do. Held Jason tightly, gently started sort of, just shaking him very, very gently and saying, "Oh, come on, Jason, come back to us, what's going on?" And the more Jason started to blink, the more he sort of came around, then the less the noise got. Until finally, Jason was wide awake, realised he was in his dad's arms, gave him a big wet kiss and said, "Oh, can I watch telly?" He had no idea what had happened. Paul picked the phone up again, which was working perfectly. He phoned the police, told them about what had happened, didn't mention Jason's part in it. And within a few minutes, there was a police car around, and it had stopped raining. It stopped raining about half an hour before that. And the police went around the property. They came back to the door and they said, "Well, we've searched everywhere." They said, "There's no sign of anyone being about. There's no footprints in the mud." And they said, "With all this rain, there would be footprints. There would be something, but there's nothing." As I say, after that event, things really kicked off in our house. We had a lot of poltergeist effect, things going on. Furniture would be dragged across the floor. Kettle would boil dry. The TV would start blaring in the middle of the night, even though it wasn't plugged in. The hob would come on. As I say, taking plugs out made absolutely no difference at all. We even got an electrician in to check out all the circuits, thinking, well, it's got to be something. I remember at that time that when I was growing up, we had a ghost in our house, or poltergeist activity, if you like. And I remember that to make it less scary, my dad decided to call him Charlie, which sort of, alleviated things a little bit. So we called our ghost Charlie. Daniel thought it was great, but Jason was absolutely terrified. This went on for years. As I say, Jason's story never, ever changed. He would always talk about the little men that came into his room that would take him to a hospital place, and they would hurt him sometimes, and then they would bring him back again. I'll just say that it wasn't until Jason was 12 years old, that we really started to get an idea of what was actually going on. At that time, because of his nightmares, shall we say, he was already seeing a psychiatrist. We watched, that particular night, we watched a programme on the TV, and it was a programme on hypnosis. The usual thing, where they use hypnosis for entertainment value, this sort of thing. That just shows you, it gives you another idea of, obviously, the way our boys grew up. It's Jason with his horses. Now, this is a drawing that I did, both from Jason's description and later from my own memories. Now, this, as I say, is a letter that was sent to our GP. I don't know if you can see it very well there, but I'll just read a little bit for you. She talks about Jason. This is from the psychiatrist to the GP. She says, "Jason is still having his strange experiences at night. He showed me a patch on his tummy which was fading brown but had been red earlier, and he felt that this was connected with the visitations." If you look at the bottom piece as well, it says the patch on his tummy was triangular, approximately 2-inch sides and slightly brownish, but having no raised component or edges. It was apparently red on the morning that he came to see me. Now, I remember that very clearly because Jason woke very frightened, very scared. But for me, it was like, well, good, at least we've now got something that we can show her to proof, if you like, of what he's been saying, what we've been saying. And I remember that she couldn't, she sort of lifted her glasses up and sort of prodded and poked a little bit, and then she called all her colleagues in, and they did the same sort of thing, and they were all scratching their heads, so what the hell is it? It's not an injury of any type. But then something happened. As I say, we watched a program on hypnosis. As I say, it was about, entertainment value to start with, and then it was about using hypnosis for people's fears, like phobias of spiders, helping people to stop smoking, that sort of thing. And we were interested because the next segment was going to be a lorry driver who had missing time. And the only thing he could remember was driving his lorry and seeing a very bright light. But it had impacted on his life so much that he'd lost his wife over it and couldn't sleep without a light on, etc. And it was just pure sort of just curiosity, I suppose. At that point, Jason picked up an ornament and he threw it at the TV set. And of course, Paul jumped up and he was like, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And he turned to us and he had tears running down his face and he said, "That man on there is so stupid." He said, "He shouldn't want to know what happens to him." He said, "Because I know what happens." He said, "I remember everything." He said, "And I don't want to remember." And with that point, he went out into the kitchen. The three of us just sat there, Paul and I sat there looking at each other. And Daniel, who by now was 16, he looked at us sort of rather contemptuously and he said, "Don't you get it yet?" And we were both like, "Get what?" And he said, "He's being taken." He said, "He's being abducted by aliens." And of course we both, yeah, right, And he looked at us, and for once he was deadly serious. And he said, "Mum," he said, "do you remember me telling you about my friend when I was little, about Eunice?" I said, "Yes, of course." And he said, "He was real, Mum." He said, "He wasn't something out of my imagination." He said, "He was real." He said, he told me that they will be working with Jason. He said, "I was fine with them visiting," he said. And he said, "I used to go to, these places that Jason talks about when they took me." He said, "But I was always fine with that." He said, "Jason isn't." He said, "He can't handle it, Mum." He said, "He's absolutely terrified." We went out into the kitchen and Jason was still sobbing. And we sat down with him and we got him to talk to us about what was happening to him. He went, as I say, his story never changed over all those years. He said that he was taken to a hospital place. He was taken out through the walls, through the windows. And he said he was always sort of found, that they would always sort of lay him on some sort of slab. He said it was like marble. But he said everything in there had no corners. He said it was always like rounded corners. We listened. And I suppose for the first time, we really listened properly. We said to him, "Okay, we believe you." To be honest, it wasn't that we did totally believe him, but we believed that he believed it. And that to us was the difference. So we decided to go out the next day and sort out some go to bookshops, sort out books, and try and find out a little bit more about the subject. Obviously, we didn't get many books because this was back in the 90s and there weren't that many books written. But some of the titles we did get, we just sort of thumbed through them. And, I'd say to Paul, "God, this has happened to us." And then he'd find something. He'd say, "Well, this just happened, a few weeks ago." It was sort of becoming, I suppose, not obvious, but we were starting to wonder about all this. It was at that time, I don't know if any of you remember the UFO magazine, which was in circulation for a few years, but we contacted Tony Dodd, who we now refer to as our lifeline. And so that was a very strange conversation because I think I hung up on poor man 3 times because how do you start a conversation like that? It's just too out there, or it certainly was for us at the time. But we finally spoke to him and he asked me some questions which obviously only, family or somebody having experiences would know the answer to. As I said, we then started to refer to him as our lifeline because, we found that we could ring him anytime, we could tell him anything. He was always very calm and authoritative. And, he would always say to me, "I'm not talking to you till you calm down." And of course, I'd sort of blurt out, the next thing that had gone on, etc. So Jason was still seeing a psychiatrist at that time. This is another letter that we got from the GP got from the psychiatrist. And if you look at the bottom part there, the top part says Jason is still having this alien experience. There have been various other experiences which they consider paranormal, electrical upsets, animals spooked, etc. Jason has been talking to Mr. Dodds of Quest International, whom he finds very helpful. And then at the bottom, which I think is most important, it says, we talked as how to live with his experiences. And then it says quite clearly, these do not appear to be psychotic. So in other words, Jason was not mentally ill. So what he'd been saying for all these years was the truth. I should mention as well that, in our quest to find what was troubling our youngest son, we dragged him from one hospital to another. He'd had tests for sleep epilepsy. He'd had things stuck on his head to find out if he had any brain problems, which might be causing hallucinations. The usual sort of thing, which obviously in hindsight, I really wish to God we hadn't. But I think at that time, because we were sort of very rational people, we had a lot of faith in the medical profession, and we really wanted somebody to say, oh, well, it's this. I'll give you some pills, get him to take these, he'll be fine. Obviously that didn't happen. But at least now we knew what was going on. And for Jason, it was a turning point because he wasn't on his own. We were now listening to him, and we were totally with him. So there's another picture of Jason with his best friend Cardi. That was when he was about 17, 18, I believe. I know now that, abduction does run in families. And it seemed like when we said to Jason that we believed him, it was like, I would start to remember things from my childhood. There were a couple of experiences that I remembered clearly, things that I couldn't explain. I had one vision, if you like, which haunted me. It haunted me for all of my childhood and all my adult life, if I'm honest. And that was of not being able to sleep one night, getting in my mum's bed with her because my dad was working late. Again, not being able to sleep, but then looking over the blankets and realising that there was somebody standing at the bottom of the bed. I always referred to him as a monk because that's what it looked like. It was a tall, very tall figure in a long sort of flowing garment with a hood. And I remember this being moving around the side of the bed, and I was frantically trying to wake my mum. I couldn't wake my mum. Our collie dog was asleep at the bottom of the bed, and he wouldn't be woken either. And obviously I was absolutely terrified. And the last memory I have of this is when he sort of put his hands up to pull the hood back. And I couldn't remember anything after that. I always had that experience. I always knew it was real. And then I realised that my mum's attitude to that, when I told her, was the same as mine had been with Jason. She'd said to me, oh, it's not real. You've had a dream. You've had a nightmare. And then I suddenly realised I've actually been saying the same thing to my son. And then I realised how angry and frustrated I'd felt at that as well, when my mother wouldn't believe me. As I say, I suppose even now I carry a lot of guilt for not believing my son when, all those years that were wasted, that he was telling us what was going on. But as I say, time moves on, things move on. So after that time, Jason was becoming a lot more comfortable with his experiences. He was no longer afraid of things that were happening. When he was about 17, I suppose, I started receiving letters from people in other countries. And, I opened the first one morning, and basically it was from a gentleman, and he was thanking me for allowing Jason to be with them, to be with the aliens, the ETs, when they came for him. I couldn't believe this. I thought, oh, what a load of nonsense. It's one thing to accept that, you have a child that has experiences, but it's quite another when, you start getting things like this. But the letters kept coming. I sort of gathered quite a stack of these letters. So to quote from one of them, this is from a gentleman in Sydney, Australia. He says, then suddenly there he was. Jason was with the aliens, and I was not frightened at all. Rather, I was exhilarated and filled with a special feeling of really strong sharing that is difficult to describe in words. But I got the very clear feeling of invitation from the aliens and from Jason himself. There's another one from a lady in Pretoria. She says, something then happened which caught me completely unaware. I became aware of a very strong feeling in my mind. It was like someone had come into the room, not unwelcome, but just there. But it didn't alarm me, it just surprised me. I had the feeling that I was being watched, but this didn't bother me either. The feeling grew to being watched, not from the outside, but from the inside. It was of another consciousness within my own mind. It was very gentle and soothing. At first I saw nothing, but I sensed something very strongly. What I sensed was someone sending very calm, very soothing feelings, very beautiful, peaceful feelings. Then I felt his presence very strongly. It was Jason who was contacting me. I experienced the calming, the care, and then I saw something which made me realize that this was not imagination. I just knew that it was. I just felt his presence and sending those very calming thoughts and feelings. It was very beautiful, and it's left a very deep impression on me. And then just a couple more, short ones. There was a gentleman in Melbourne who said, I feel that in the area of intuition, Jason has a great deal to teach me, that he can affect my mind development and help me to understand and learn what I need. And then finally, a gentleman in Gibraltar. He said, I felt Jason's care, his concern, his understanding. I feel that his power is such that just his thoughts can guide me, can teach me. And I would love him to do this if it's possible, but only if you are happy for him to do so. I couldn't cope with this. This was one step too far for me. I wasn't brave enough to speak to Jason about it either. I just remember sort of going to bed in tears one particular night after I got another letter. I found it hard to sleep, but I was woken up this particular night by a lot of noise in the living room. So I went downstairs, and Paul was working away, believing that perhaps I'd shut one of the cats in accidentally, and it was obviously trying to get out. And I opened the door, and as I opened the door, I went to reach for the light. There in the middle of the room was our dog, Hannah. Hannah had died a couple of months before, but she was real. She was absolutely solid and real. And I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't even question, the rationality of it. I didn't even think about it. I was just so overjoyed to see her, and she felt the same. And I remember, she came over to me and she was squeaking, and, her tail was going 10 to the dozen, and, I was just fussing her and hugging her, and then, of course, I got very emotional, started to cry. And I put my hand up to wipe away the tears, and I looked back, and she'd gone. And, of course, I looked around the room, calling her, but, as I said, she'd gone. That was when I noticed that there was somebody standing in the corner. It was like a very tall man, almost, but in, sort of long, flowing garments. I couldn't see his features, but strangely, I wasn't scared of him either. He was very familiar to me. He stepped forward and he said to me in a very soft voice, he told me to get a pen and paper, and he said, you need to write this down, which I did. I don't remember what happened after that, but I remember waking up the next morning, obviously, and I came downstairs, started my usual chores, and it wasn't until I went into the living room, and of course I saw the spilled cups, where Hannah's towel had knocked the coffee cups over, and suddenly it all came rushing back, and I thought, wow, what a weird dream. But then I looked on the table, and there was a pad with my writing on it. This is what I wrote. All things are possible beyond the limits of your earthbound consciousness. Open your heart and your mind to the truth of what I am telling you. If you seek the truth, you must have faith, belief in the universe. Learn to look beyond what your eyes can see and draw upon the ancient knowledge of your own inner being, your soul self. For only then will the truth emerge. Embrace it lovingly, for it is a destiny retrieved from time, your time. Now, I don't confess to knowing exactly what that was all about, but it somehow gave me the confidence and the courage, if you like, to speak to Jason about, these letters, which were still coming in. Of course, I tackled him the next morning over breakfast, and I told him, and he said, well, can I see the letters, Mum? So I showed him, and he sort of, whizzed through them, and a big grin appeared on his face, and he gave them back, and he just looked at me and said, well, cool. Of course, I then went into full mum mode and, what do you mean it's cool? Do you realise what you're doing? All these years that you've had problems with this and you've been terrified, and yet here you are helping them to take other people. This isn't right. This just isn't right, Jason. He just put his spoon down and he said, Mum, he said, do you remember? He said in the beginning, he said how terrified I was. And I said, well, of course I do. And he said, do you remember? He said that you couldn't believe me. He said, you were always there for me in the sense that, mum and dads are. He said, but you couldn't believe me. And I said, well, yes, it's my biggest regret. And he said, a lot of these people, he said, don't have anybody. He said, they can't speak to anyone. He said, and most of them are absolutely terrified. He said, we all decide before we come here if we are going to go through these experiences. He said, in our conscious mind, we don't accept that. He said, basically, I'm there to help people. He said, because by seeing another human being, by seeing me, if you like, he said, I can then sort of chat to people. He said, and I can say, how's things going? My name's Jason, etc., etc. He said, it reduces the fear. He said, because fear narrows the goalposts. He said, this thing needn't be fear-based. He said, okay. He said, it can be absolutely terrifying. He said, because something is happening outside of your social network, if you like, your social upbringing. It's not part of growing up. It's not part of normal life, if you like. He said, of course, when something happens out of the ordinary, he said, it can be absolutely terrifying. He said, as it was for me. He said, just by being there with them, he said, traveling with them, he said, to help other people. He said, it's part of who I am. It's part of what I do. That was quite a speech from Jason. With Jason's experiences, this started giving me back a lot of my memories, my experiences. And there was one particular one which I remember vividly. I'll just relate a couple. There was this one particular time when I was about 6 and I was walking in the park with my dad. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and suddenly these 3 people appeared in front of us. They were very sort of normally dressed, but they were very sort of suntanned, because I remember thinking, this was obviously back in the 60s, giving away my age there, but never mind. But this was back in the 60s, and of course I sort of looked at them and I thought how rich they must be, because they can afford to go abroad to get suntans like that. My dad sort of pushed me behind him, like, not hard, but just sort of gently sort of pushed me behind him. And I sort of peeped out from behind him and I was looking at these people. And then suddenly, it was obvious that my dad knew them, but I was still a little bit fearful. And then suddenly I was aware that we weren't in the park anymore, because you couldn't smell the grass, the sun wasn't shining. I didn't know where we were or how we got there. Then the 3 that had been in the park were now sort of dressed differently. They had like long flowing garments. And this man stepped forward. I now believe that this man is actually Junus, as he calls himself, which was the guy that, or the being that used to visit Daniel. And he stepped forward and he put his hand out to me. I couldn't help myself but take his hand. And I remember walking along this huge corridor with him. It was a very well-lit corridor. Again, with very smooth sides. Jason described no angles anywhere. Everything was very rounded and smooth. And I was walking along with him, and I kept looking back towards my dad, as if to say, look, you tell me all the time about going off with strangers, and you're letting this man take me away. My dad just stood there and watched. I remember being taken to a room. This man or this being opened the door and took me into this room, and then he let my hand go. And there were dozens of children in there. And, it was very noisy, very different to what we just come from. It was very noisy in the room. And there were, as I say, dozens of children playing with toys, with books, with, building blocks. And I saw this little boy who was about the same age, and straight away I recognised him. I don't know why. To this day, I don't know why. But I went over to him and sat down in front of him, and there we were sort of playing together with these blocks. Now, I don't know what happened after that, or if indeed anything did happen after that, or whether it was my dad that was, interesting. But as I say, that was one of my experiences. I showed you pictures of our home in the beginning because, as I said, it's quite relevant. I feel now, and I do believe that on on a lot of occasions, our home is protected. I don't know how, I don't know why, and I don't know with what, but I feel it's protected, and I think what I'm about to tell you, which can all be verified, will, push that point. Now, it was about sort of early September, and as I say, I put up this picture of this field, and in early September, the wheat crop was very high. Across this field one day, sort of well on the other side, because our house will be sort of right over to the right-hand side, And a fire started on the other side of this field. Because of the dry weather and, with so much to burn, the fire was soon about 6 feet high and very many metres long. And it started burning towards the house. And it sort of, started arriving very quickly. Of course, the fire brigade were called and they were already sort of starting to tackle the blaze. Of course, we could just about, the smoke was so thick that you could just about see through it. And the firefighter came over and he said, you need to be ready to get out of the house. He said, if we can't stop this thing, then, you need to be ready. And I went into the living room and Jason was sitting there reading. Daniel was running around like a headless chicken, much like his mum. I said to Jason, right, get up, come on, we've got to go let the horses out. We've got to make sure the birds can get out and all this sort of thing. And he looked at him and he said, no, you don't. He said, fire won't touch us. He said, we're protected. And I said, oh, don't be so ridiculous. So, just leaving him and sort of mumbling something about, lazy little what's it. And I went out, opened the horses' paddock, chased the horses out. They were sort of charging up and down, obviously terrified. By that time, more fire engines had arrived. And what they'd done, the fire crews had actually parked 2 of their engines behind the fire, behind the blaze. So they were fighting the fire from behind. And when the fire got to the edge of the lane, incredibly, it split. It's to say that, you had this sort of 6-foot flame in front of the house. Then to this side and this side, the fire came over the lane. It started burning again in the fields beside us. But in front of the house, it didn't. It started burning backwards. And the fire crews obviously were very concerned and sort of, were obviously had to get their fire engines out of the way very quickly, otherwise we risked losing them. It was an incredible situation. But afterwards, they obviously won eventually, and they were all sitting. We had dozens of these firefighters sitting on the grass, and I was making tea and coffee for everyone just to say thank you. And I said to a group of them, why did it do that? They just said, I don't know, never seen that before. And I said, well, could it have been the wind change? And they said, yeah, but if the wind had changed, the whole fire would have moved. They said, we've never, ever seen anything like that before. And then, of course, they started joking about, perhaps the house is charmed. And then, they were doing all these spooky noises between them. And I thought, OK, that's my cue to leave. That was one particular incident concerning the house. But there was another time when, we had friends over. Ellis Taylor, your other speaker, was also another one. And they were outside with some other people. And we live about a mile from the sea. And, of course, they were sort of, suddenly aware of this seagull that was flying sort of quite low, because of the awful noise they make. Just as this seagull was approaching the house, obviously to fly over the house, it was like it hit something. And it just dropped. It wasn't hurt at all. It pretty much rallied itself and flew off in a different direction. But then, of course, when, say, these guys were telling me about it, my thought was, well, what on earth did it hit for it to do that? There was nothing there. It was just sky. I might be wrong, but I just feel very strongly that, on certain occasions, the house is protected. By the time Jason was in his early 20s, he decided that he should speak in public, which he started to do. He was invited to America quite a few times. We went to Italy together. He was a very popular speaker. Now, the last conference that he did was at Probe in Blackpool, and I'll tell you why. Just before that, I had a phone call one morning, and it was a Mrs. Bradshaw, and she told me that she lived in a house just down the lane from us. And she said, I got your number from the phone book. She said, you're in the phone book. She said, it's a strange thing last night. She said, my husband and I were woken up because there was a noise in our garage. She said, and he went out there. She said, all the lights were on. She said, and he went out armed with a baseball bat. She said, and he said to me, right, call the police. She said, and he went out to the garage expecting, to find youngsters sort of, having a great time or whatever they do. She said, there was this guy, she said, in his early 30s. She said, dark suit, dark tie, very, very smart. She said, very shiny shoes. She said, and he was just sorting through all our boxes. She said, of course, she said, my husband, he was a bit shocked, but she said he challenged him. What the hell do you think you're doing? She said, and this guy just looked up and he smiled and he said, I want to speak to Anne Andrews. And, of course, Mr. Bradshaw said, I don't know anybody by that name, which obviously he didn't. And the guy said, you sure? And he just smiled at him and he said, of course I'm damn sure. Leave our stuff alone. What are you doing here? And then his wife came in and she said, I phoned the police. Police are on their way. it didn't sort of faze this guy at all. He just went on, sort of going through things, and, he moved on to another box. This went on, but she said to me, it was really odd, she said, because she said, he scared the life out of us. She said, we just felt that we shouldn't approach him. She said, there was no reason for it. She said, and I don't know why we felt like that. She said, then we could hear the sirens coming down the road. She said, and he stopped. She said, and smiling, he just walked straight past us. She said, we couldn't stop him. She said, we found ourselves getting out of the way. She said, my husband said, right, we'll follow him, take down the car number. She said, and he walked out, he crossed the lane, and he walked straight into the fields. She said, and just vanished in the darkness. And she said, of course, when the police came, she said, we went into everything that happened. She said, and we said that he'd asked for you. She said, why didn't you just look in the phone book? She said, that's all I did. Got no idea who it is or who it was. She said, the police have made a report. She said, they're going to phone me back this afternoon. She said, because they said, it's very, very weird. She phoned me later and she said, well, I've not heard anything. Have you? She said, because they said they were going to get in touch with you. And I said, no, I haven't, but I'll ring them. Finally, this guy said, oh, yeah, don't worry about that. That's all been sorted. And I said, well, how's it been sorted? Oh, you don't need to know that. It's just been sorted. And she phoned me back, and she related the same thing. They told her the same thing. So basically, that was the end of that. We don't know how it was sorted, who it was even, or... Anyway, a couple of days after that, we came home from shopping to find that our back door was wide open. The house had been broken into. Of course, we went running in. We found that our old dog had been locked in, the small utility room. So she was safe enough. Nothing was taken. Everything was still there, except that the computer was switched on. There were a lot of personal letters, experiencers had been writing to me, sort of asking for my help, which, I was obviously responding to. And, the computer, everything I kept on it had been wiped. So, of course, we called the police and, a single officer arrived sometime later. And he went round the house and he checked the door and then he came into us and he said, have you got some sort of valuable collection? And he said, well, that's really odd, he said, because he said, this isn't the work of teenagers. He said, this is a professional job. He said, the way they've got into your house, he said, is very professional. He said, you sure you've got nothing of value? And we again said no, and then Paul said, obviously not wanting to say too much, he said, perhaps they got the wrong house. So just shrugged and sort of filled out that we had to have the insurance, etc. And he just said, yeah, I suppose so. That's when things really started kicking off, big time. As I said, Jason and I were speaking, all over the place. We had a talk in Chicago. And coming out of getting to the airport to fly home, we were actually detained by the FBI. To this day, we don't know why. They never said anything. They just went through all our things. We missed our flight home and had to go home on separate planes. Then it got really, really bizarre. First of all, I'll show you a few clips of things that have been photographed at our home, not by us. This was taken by a good friend of ours, Christopher Martin. Some of you may have heard of Chris. Now, this appeared in our garden in 2006, and we've seen it many, many times. This one was taken by Ellis Taylor. He stayed overnight in Jason's old bedroom, and he was woken by a blue light. This was taken. You can see the orbs. This is the lane to the front of our property. The orange lights in the background are from the main road. But you can see the orbs there. This one, that's not the moon. This was taken by me with a disposable camera because they're the only ones I'm any good with. So this was taken a few years ago in the front garden, and this thing was absolutely enormous, and it was just hanging there. And it was there for a good few hours. Again, this is orbs to the front fields. Well, you can see it's just absolutely snowballing with orbs there. This picture was actually taken by Mike Oram. I believe he spoke at your conference last year. Mike and Fran are good friends of ours too. Now this one, again, I took with a disposable camera, but the strange thing is, if you look on the far corner, I think you can just about make out someone looking over the fence. Now that's a 6'6" security fence. So whatever this was had to be at least 7 feet, if not 7'6" tall. We've got no idea what it was. I'm afraid, that's where our bravery ends. We're not brave enough to sort of go diving out there and investigate. This figure was clearly seen several times. Now this, again, this was taken with my little disposable camera. This was taken a few years ago. You can see in the foreground, the grandchildren sort of made an effort to make a snowman. There's the shovel beside it, but it's behind it. Now, what I took originally was a photograph of little tiny red fairy lights. I could see them through the window, and it was like they was like dancing around almost. So I thought, well, that's something you don't see every day. So out came the camera, and I snapped that. Now, when I got the pictures back, this is what I got back. Now, we've got a friend who works for Scotland Yard in the forensics department, and I showed it to him, and I actually sent him 'cause when you get films developed in those days, you could get like the negatives. And I sent him the negative, and he sent it back with a letter to me saying, well, I've done all the tests. As far as I'm concerned, as far as my team are concerned, this is genuine. They said, it's not a reflection of anything. We can't explain what it is. I don't know what it is. Thought again, something really interesting, so I'll put it out there for you guys. We had another friend that we'd met through all of this, Paula Harris, who's a well-known photojournalist. Now, she came and stayed with us for a few days, and I won't go into what happened. Suffice it to say that Paula was supposed to stay with us for a week, and on the second night, she said to me, please, can you book me into a hotel? I can't stay here any longer. And we said to her, well, we felt really bad. We said, why? And she said, no. She said, there's just too much going on. She says that she'd sort of lay in the bed, and she'd hear heavy footsteps running upstairs, get to her room, she said, and the handle would move. She said, of course, I'd be lying there, so I anticipate somebody sort of throwing the door back and flouncing into the room. She said, and then nothing happened. She said, and then she said, I'll be woken up by voices. She said, in the room. She said, it sounded like three people in conversation. And as I say, there was a lot of other stuff that was going on in that room and around that room, which was really freaking her out. But the interesting thing is, as I say, she's a photojournalist, so she's got the top stuff. And she took this picture of her room. And if you look at the curtain and the lamp and the bottle, they're all in focus. Now, again, she took this to people that she knows, and they can't say why the picture is like that. Why is it so out of focus on most of it, but just a couple of things are in focus? And she's, I'm going to just take pictures of the house and, see what happens. Now, if you look at the door on the far right, just below the handle, you can see, that's a bit blurred, but you get the idea. There's something just starting to appear just by the handle. Now after taking this picture, she immediately took the next one. That energy absolutely filled the whole of the hallway and spread to the downstairs. As I say, again, being a very clever photojournalist, she actually captured it on camera, which I think is always good when other people get this stuff at our home, because it sort of proves that, it's not just us saying things. It's other people have had their own experiences there. Other people have had things going on. This was the last time Jason spoke in public. This was actually taken by Ellis Taylor, and this was at Probe. Now, again, every photograph that people took came out like this of Jason. So I've put this one up just as to show you. But people were saying to us that, they could see things around him. They could see like energies, like shape-shifting, if you like, moving about. Now, as I say, that was the last time that he spoke. Up to that time, he'd been getting a lot of anonymous phone calls telling him to keep quiet, not to say anything. I was getting the same, but then again, I've had them, from time to time anyway, just telling me not to speak. We, for the most part, ignored them, thought, nothing of it. We'd gone up to Blackpool in my car. Now, my car had just had the MOT done the day before. And Paul's very particular, my husband. He's a total, car fanatic, but he uses a most reliable garage. The car had been MOT'd the day before. It was all fine. It passed straight away. Yet on the way home, thankfully there were roadworks and everything on the motorway, and it was pouring down with rain, which worked in our favour as it happens, because on the way home the brakes went. I suddenly sort of went to hit the brake, and suddenly there was no brake. So I swerved off onto the hard shoulder, tried the brake again, absolutely nothing. This was an automatic, so I couldn't even sort of, slow the car down. We called the AA, and they came out with a recovery truck. They took the car up to local services, and the AA guy went over and he said, "Yeah, so you're right." He said, "You got no brakes at all." So of course we were recovered home, and as you can imagine, Paul was extremely angry because he thought that the MOT station had missed something. The guy at the garage was extremely apologetic, and he said, "Right, we'll take the car in, we'll go over it." He couldn't apologise enough. Then he rang us and he said, "I swear to God," he said, "I haven't touched anything." He said, "There is nothing wrong with that car." He said, "The brakes are working fine." A few days later, Paul and I were out shopping. We were in our 4x4. Again, as we came home from the supermarket, again, there were some diversions. There were some, roadworks. So, the traffic was really slow, thankfully. I hit the brake, and same thing, nothing. So I managed to swerve onto the grass bank. And finally, the vehicle rolled to a stop, and Paul got out, and he looked, he sort of opened the engine, he looked underneath it, and then he came back, he said, "I don't believe this." He said, "The brake cable's been cut." He said, "It hasn't just snapped." He said, "It's been cut." So, of course, we called the police there and then. This police officer went underneath it. "Oh, yeah," he said, "yeah, your brake pipe's been cut." "Yeah, well, yeah, we knew that." And then he got on his radio, came back to us, and he said, "Wouldn't worry about it." He says, "Probably kids. But, this is dangerous. And he said, "You left it in the supermarket car park." He said, "Could have been like, a gang of kids going round there and just having a bit of fun," he said, and which obviously didn't help us at all, but it was clear that he wasn't going to do anything about it. The third thing that happened was this. In 2007, Jason's car was run off the road. It spun in the air several times before careering down an embankment, landing on its roof. He said that he was driving just normally. Thankfully, there was an off-duty police officer driving behind him, which obviously didn't know at the time. And he said this car pulled level with him, had 4 guys in it. He said the driver looked across at him. He said, unbelievably, the driver grabbed the handbrake. He said, which forced his car to spin on the spot, if you like. He said the back of the guy's car hit the corner of Jason's, which caused it to spin up into the air and come down like that. That's another one. You can see the roof. It was left to the policewoman who was in the car behind, because obviously all the traffic stopped. She went down there expecting to find, fatalities. And incredibly, Jason was just about kicking the glass out the door so he could get out. And he just got out, stood up, brushed himself off. Going off subject a little bit, I believe that there is a correlation between spiritual activity and alien ET activity, if you like. And I'll tell you for why. It seems that our house is built, we now know it's built on ley lines, which, as most of you know, are energy lines. They're earth energy lines. They're natural energies which appear across the planet. Our house is actually built on a point where the ley lines cross. So whether that sort of opens doors, opens dimensions, it certainly seems to amplify whatever activity is going on. Going back a little bit, in 2006, Paul and I went on holiday to America. Got the dogs into kennels, but obviously we had cats, parrots, all sorts of livestock and everything. So we got in touch with one of these companies, the ones that come in and, they look after everything for you. And it was a very reputable company, but Paul was a little bit dubious. And at the time, well, I'll say even now, he's got a collection of watches. There's about 20 of these watches. Some are really cheap, some are quite expensive, but they've each got a story to them. They mean a lot to him because, as I say, he knows who bought each one or where he bought each one. So each one has got a story. And they mean the world to him. So what he did, he took them all out of the boxes and he wrapped them up individually in bubble wrap and he put them all in a Tesco carrier bag. He folded the bag up and he put the bag inside an old jumper. He put the old jumper at the back of the wardrobe. And that's where it stayed. And of course, when we came back from America, we collected the dogs from kennels, did the usual stuff, and he went to get his watches, and his watches weren't there. And we took that house apart looking for this bag of watches. Basically, we never found it. And obviously, Paul was absolutely devastated by this. This was back in 2006, and these watches were never, ever found. Now, in 2010, unfortunately, Paul's mum passed away. And obviously, it was a very sad time for both of us, because I loved her as much as he did. It takes time to get over these things. But about 6 months later, our good friends, James and Lynn, asked us would we be interested in going to a psychic supper, which, in case you don't know, is basically, going out for a meal. There's obviously loads of other people there. You have something to eat, you have a meal. And then afterwards, where like you get entertainment, say, after the meal's finished, a medium comes out and gives messages to people, or this sort of thing. And this guy was from London, the medium, and he was really, really good. He was giving out messages to certain people. He was extremely accurate in the messages he was giving. We didn't necessarily disbelieve anything, but we didn't, we weren't totally convinced either, if that makes sense. We were very open-minded to, to this whole thing. He said, I've got a message for Paul. And of course, there could be like dozens of Pauls in the room. He said, no, it's a lady. He said, and she passed in November, last year, of course, which was Mum. Of course, I said to Paul, that's you, it's got to be you. It must be your mum. And he was like, no, it's not for me. Of course, he wouldn't volunteer himself, so I believe we volunteered him, didn't we? We were like, oh, here he is, he's over here. And of course, the medium came over, and he looked quite confused. And he said, He said, I've got no idea what this means. He said, I'm going to say it anyway. He said, because he said, she's really, really urging me to say this. He said, and the words he said to Paul was, she says, it's about time you cleared out that barn of yours. It's about time you got rid of those old washing machines and those old fridges. She said, it's driving her mad. And of course, we just burst out laughing because we knew that, Paul had this thing that he would never throw anything away, I'll put that in the barn, I'll fix that. That's all he ever said. He never did anything about them. So, of course, you sort of gradually got this sort of big pile of, I think we had about 10, 12 sort of various washing machines, fridges and microwaves and all sorts of things. And it was always a point with his mum that whenever she came down, she'd stand in front of the barn and just say, you've got to get rid of this stuff, Paul, she said. She said to me, didn't it drive you mad? And I said, of course it does, Mum, but, he's going to fix it at some stage. And, yeah, right. And it was always like the bane of her life, if you like. That's the first thing that she would say was, have you got rid of that stuff yet? To which you sort of sheepishly say, no, Mum, not yet. But that was the message. So, of course, we knew about, the stuff in the barn, so we started laughing. The next day, he was out there in the barn, and he got his trailer, and he'd started sort of putting, these machines on the trailer to take them to the tip. He picked up a tumble dryer. Now, it was our tumble dryer, which we'd had in the house up till about 6 months ago. When it had stopped working properly. So bearing in mind that this tumble dryer had only been in the barn for repair for about 6 months. And he picked it up, and just as I'm taking out a cup of coffee for him, he went to put it on the tray, but he tripped. But he tripped over nothing. There was nothing for him to trip over. And of course, the machine went flying, he went down, and I rushed to help him up, and I said, what on earth did you trip over? And he said, I don't know, there's nothing there. He got up, he was unhurt. And he went to pick the machine up, and the door had flung open, as it landed. He said to me, oh, look at this. And inside was a box. It was a big red box. And we had, he said, what's that doing in there? And I said, well, I've got no idea. I've not seen it before. It's nothing to do with us. And it was a very elaborate box, like leather-covered, with a big sort of, brass clasp on the front. And it took us quite a while to get this box out of the machine because it been really wedged in there hard. We took it inside, and he didn't know where the box had come from either, and we opened the box, and inside was a Tesco carrier bag. And we opened the Tesco carrier bag, and there was every single one of Paul's watches. I don't know, is that just coincidence? But then again, we'd only put the machine in there 6 months before, and where did the box come from? Is there, to my mind, is there somebody out there sort of, scratching their head saying, well, I know I put it there, but the box is gone. How should I say? That there is a very thin line, I think, between ET activity and paranormal activity and spiritual activity. And I think the two are very closely linked. As I say, coming back to, just briefly, to our situation, Jason's situation, obviously after such a horrendous accident, Jason started taking the warnings seriously. As I said, after Probe, which I believe he did a lot of good work at Probe, he stopped talking because he said he won't put his family in danger. As I say, from that day to this, he's just, he gets on with his work because I know that he can astral travel. I know that, he sort of traverses dimensions. I know he's out there helping other people. And that's fine with him. He said, so this is what I do. This is what I'll continue to do. But he says he won't speak publicly. This is an Apache blessing, but I thought it was very relevant because I believe that most of the indigenous peoples around this planet are a lot more forward-thinking than we are. They've encountered these star nations, they've encountered these beings for many, many hundreds of years, and it's given them a different outlook on things. It's for the Native Americans, it's like the blessing says, may the sun bring you new energy by day, may the moon softly restore you by night, may the rain wash away your worries, may the breeze blow new strength into your being. May you walk gently through the world and know its beauty all the days of your life. Finally, just as a final point from me, what I'd like to say just to everybody that's out there today is may you all find what you are looking for in this life, and may that lead you to be all that you can possibly be. Thank you very much.